Hi, I'm Don from Don Drones On. This video focuses on regulatory violations and fines related to drone operations in Canada, and is a follow-up to a similar video I did a couple of years ago. I'll look at how things are trending in terms of the number of violations and how much people have been charged. Then we'll look at a few sample cases. Let's dive in. Transport Canada publishes what they call aviation enforcement actions on a public web page divided into corporate offenders and non-corporate offenders. There have been no corporate drone violations in the past 2 years. In the case of non-corporate violations, the individuals involved are not named and the descriptions of the charges are completely generic, really. For each case, the date of the violation is listed as well as the date the occurrence was published. And these are miles apart. We'll look at the stats for that in a minute. The most recent case published occurred in June of 2024 and was published in March of 2025, and that was actually a quick one. In each case, the CARS violations are listed, the amount of penalty issued is stated, and which of the 5 Transport Canada regions it occurred in. Let's start with some basic stats. There's been a total of only 68 individual occurrences since 2019, about roughly a dozen a year. Now, each occurrence can have more than one violation, so there have been a total of 210 separate violations, or what TC calls counts, across these 68 cases, with an average of 3.5 violations per occurrence. The most was 7 violations in 2 separate cases back in 2022. Average total fines are increasing and are now typically $1,500 or more. The maximum fine ever was $3,950, involving 5 violations in what appears to be a prison drop. The maximum fine for a single rule violation was $1,000, which was the fine issued in the Toronto Buttonville case where a police drone collided with a Cessna. Finally, one oddity is that it seems to take a very long time from the date of a violation to the time it is published on the enforcement webpage, often around a year or more. Let's dig into the details on all of these. First, the number of drone enforcement occurrences per quarter, anywhere from 1 to 9. And while the trend sort of looks like it's dropping, keep in mind that the 2024 data is only the first half of the year. I was actually surprised at how random this is. I would have expected most, or at least more, of the violations in the summertime, so Q2 and Q3, but it's actually all over the place. And this spike in the first quarter of 2022 seems to be linked to the dates of the COVID trucker strike events, when there were a lot of violations and tickets handed out. Here's the same data, just aggregated to the year level instead of down to the quarter. About a dozen enforcement occurrences per year. Now, I should mention that on the TC website, they emphasize that actually handing out a fine to an individual, or what they call euphemistically an administrative monetary penalty, is more of a last resort. They state their policy is one of fairness and firmness, encouraging open communications, and often providing oral counseling for minor violations where there was really no threat to public safety. Now, unfortunately, they don't publish any statistics for these warnings, just for these more extreme cases of fines being handed out. So, moving on, this chart shows the number of occurrences of fines in red, plus the number of violations in each year in orange. The blue line shows the number of regulatory violations per occurrence, with a fairly consistent average of around 3.5 over the past few years. Now, when you look at the fines themselves, shown in green, it's pretty clear that recently the total fines are going up. If you're not let off with a warning, you could be facing around $1,500 in fines. But the amount you are penalized will depend mostly on the number of violations. Over the years, about half the fines have been around $250 per individual violation, and the other half in the $300 to $600 range. Only rarely are the individual violation fines more than that. The total fines per occurrence show a slightly different picture. About a third are under $500. About 29% are between $500 and $1,000 total, and the remaining 36% of occurrences were north of $1,000 in penalties. The highest was, as I said, $3,950 for what seems to be like a prison drop in 2022. Let's look at how the violations were distributed across Canada. Well over half of the occurrences were in Quebec, followed by Ontario with about 30%. Apparently, our angelic drone pilots live on either the Atlantic or Pacific coasts and in the prairies and northern region, with virtually no violations there. This distribution of drone fine occurrences is wildly out of whack compared to the population distribution shown in this pie chart. And of course, it's impossible to say whether this discrepancy, such as the enormous number of occurrences in Quebec versus the prairies, is due to some inexplicable drone pilot behavior or the leniency or strictness level of the Transport Canada enforcement team. Or maybe it's just the number of inspectors out there. Now, I mentioned earlier that the gap in time between a violation occurring and that violation being published on the website was quite large. Here's a graphical representation of this, with the oldest occurrences on the left and the most recent ones on the right. Up until 2021, the timing was kind of all over the place. In 2022, things seemed to stabilize in the 6 to 10 month range, but then mysteriously jumped to a fairly consistent gap of around a year. I have no idea what might be driving this gap to increase, but it's remarkably apparent. So far, we've talked about the number of violations, the amounts of the fines, and where the violations occurred. But what are people getting charged with? I analyzed the 210 individual violations since 2019 and grouped them into about a dozen categories. Almost a quarter of the cases were some form of pilot certification issue, either no pilot certificate at all, or cases where you needed to be an advanced pilot but only had your basic. Another quarter of the violations related to flying where you weren't authorized, either controlled airspace, too close to an airport, or in a Class F restricted zone. And another big chunk of the violations were tied to registration of the drones, which is probably a simple thing to nail you with once you already have been caught for some other violation. There were 22 cases of flying near an advertised event without an SFOC, 11 for flying out of visual line of sight, and 10 for various procedural missteps, such as no site survey or not having checklists, and so on down the line. It's interesting that there has been only one fine handed out for flying with an FPV device, but no spotter. Let's wrap this up by taking a look at some of the most recent occurrences, starting with this one that took place in June of 2024, somewhere in Ontario. The person was caught flying in controlled airspace without authorization. Fairly straightforward. One count with a fine of $390. The next occurrence is quite different. January 2024 in Quebec. 6 counts for a total fine of $3,750. If you read through the text, it's saying that an unregistered drone that was in some way not serviceable had an improperly attached payload and was flying out of visual line of sight in a Class F restricted zone. Was this a prison drop? Yeah, probably. Now, this one was unusual because the occurrence was actually split over 2 days, with some violations in December of 2023 and the rest in January of 2024. Now, I'm assuming this was some sort of a repeat offender, so they ended up with a pretty hefty $3,000 fine. It appears to be a basic pilot flying without their paperwork, and notice that they got nailed for a non-drone violation. So it's a non-901 violation for refusing to produce some form of documentation. In December, they were caught in controlled airspace, despite having only their basic certification. Then in January, they were at an advertised event without an SFOC, all in the Quebec region. The next most recent case was also in Quebec, this time drawing 3 counts for a total of $720. In this case, a basic pilot was flying in controlled airspace and at an advertised event without an SFOC. Very similar violations to the previous case, but with a lower fine, probably because it wasn't a repeat offender. We'll close with two simple cases, both in Quebec in August of 2023, a few days apart. In both cases, a drone over 250 grams was flying at advertised events without an SFOC. $300 and $600 fines. So what does all this mean for you as a drone pilot? Well, first of all, it's clear that Transport Canada does indeed hand out fines for violations of the drone regulations, but not very often. Presumably, there are a lot more cases of verbal warnings being given, at least in minor cases or where there may be some sort of mitigating circumstances. Secondly, your risk of being penalized varies widely across the country, with Quebec being disproportionately strict compared to the other regions. I think everyone knows that the rules are very complicated and in some cases way overboard. It's remarkably easy to violate regulations from time to time, no matter how careful you are. I simply urge you to really learn how to fly your drone safely, to use all the tools at your disposal to understand the risks where you're flying, fly with caution and care at all times, and in particular, be kind and considerate when flying around the public. The Drone Pilot Association of Canada has an excellent free safety course that will help you become familiar with the key things you need to know. Please check it out. Thanks for watching.